The news from Guyana, the region and the world. Compiled in the News Talk Radio newsroom and powered by DemeraraWaves.com.
The news comes to you with the compliments of Eureka Medical Laboratories. With the news at this time, I am Tiana Jordan. A very good morning to you. First, the lead stories. The United States wants the Guyana government to make its position on fighting corruption clear. Guyana Power and Light says it cannot afford to pay workers an increase in salaries or a bonus. A former policeman who was freed of a murder charge 3 months ago is suing the state for almost $100 million. Regionally, the Trinidad and Tobago government did not back Sir Hilary Beckles for a second term as Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Antigua and Barbuda hopes to strike a deal that will see the United States paying millions of dollars in compensation in keeping with a ruling by the World Trade Organization. And internationally, New Zealand will ban the sale of tobacco to its next generation in a bid to eventually phase out smoking. The details of these and other stories coming up right here in just a moment.
A COVID-19 PCR test is now mandatory for many routine activities, including travel and return-to-work purposes. At Eureka, our trained and experienced staff will ensure confidentiality while your test is conducted in a professional and timely manner, which results in just 48 hours. So the next time you require an efficient and hassle-free PCR COVID-19 test, call 624-8378, 608-8378, or 623-7233 to schedule your appointment. You can also ask about our house call testing service.
And now the news in detail. The union representing just under 1,000 workers of the state-owned Guyana Power and Light (GPL) says it is ready to accept a 7% across-the-board increase in salaries. The union says if that is paid, it will be regarded as an interim payout pending the conclusion of negotiations with GPL's management for a new collective labor agreement. But GPL's Chief Executive Officer, Bharat Dendial, says the power company cannot afford to pay more.
From a business standpoint, we don't have money to pay an increase. And typically, if in discussion with the ministry, the government, we come to a position where a particular increase is agreed, it has to be discussed in the context of how it's funded. And we know that 7% has been awarded to public servants, and that calls for a response, a team to go into those areas, and that's a huge problem right now. We are assessing how.
My apologies for that.
From a business standpoint, we don't have money to pay an increase. And typically, if in discussion with the ministry, the government, we come to a position where a particular increase is agreed, it has to be discussed in the context of how it's funded. And we know that 7% has been awarded to public servants, and the expectation of the unions currently is that they would get the 7%. But is it sustainable? We're still waiting on a detailed discussion on essentially a mandate on what is to offer. We're going to offer to the unions. We can't afford anything. Nothing at all. By the end of this year, our deficit will be about $2.6 billion. So whatever we pay basically has to be borrowed.
GPL's Chief Executive Officer, Bharat Dendial. NASI represents about 700 workers at GPL. The lowest paid worker represented by that union gets a salary of just over $70,000. The United States has suggested that the government needs to take a strong position on corruption. Issued through the American Embassy in Guyana, the U.S. government said a strong anti-corruption stance now will show Guyanese and the rest of the world that the government is committed to transparent institutions that utilize the country's resources to the long-term benefit for all Guyanese. In a message to mark International Anti-Corruption Day, which will be observed today, the U.S. said it is looking forward to the government's initiatives to combat corruption. These, the U.S. government says, include the Natural Resource Fund legislation that offers transparency and clear oversight, as well as a process that includes all stakeholders. Turning its attention to the private sector, the U.S. government said private sector actors must also answer for any role that they play in corrupt practices. The American government is advising that when choosing private sector partners, the reputable should be picked over the most convenient. The U.S. also sees important roles for a robust civil society and free press because they are critical to holding leaders responsible for their actions. The Guyana Power and Light, GPL, says it is losing at least $5 billion to electricity theft and is actively considering taking thieves to court. Power Company Chief Executive Officer Bart Dindial also says that plans are in the pipeline to move in on some areas to remove illegal connections.
Well, that calls for a response, a team to go into those areas, and that's a huge problem right now. We are assessing how do we mitigate the risk of sending into a team into an area where almost everybody's stealing, and they're prepared to bring harm to anybody who tries to dissuade them from doing that. There is nothing more we can do in hardening the network. We have done enough. In fact, there are some other strategies available to us, but the legal folks would wish to tell us that we are essentially entrapping people. But those designs are designed to kill you, basically, if you want to access power illegally. And we would not wish to get to that. We wish to step back a bit and see what else we could do.
Mr. Dindial says a number of contractors who have been hired to install prepaid meters had also been involved in electricity theft.
The approach to it basically is to deal with the low-hanging fruits, and we dealt with that. With consumers who were just openly stealing, and of course large customers in particular who were tampering with the meters, and everything was in disarray. We have dealt with that, but I think over the last 5 years we have seen that persons have actually gone back down that same road. So we're seeing large customers now who have basically gone to tamper with their systems, both using private people and of course former GPL staff.
GPL has since re-employed a loss reduction director, installed sophisticated smart meters that are being tampered with by contracted employees, and set up a data management center to detect meter tampering. Health Minister Dr. Frank Anthony says nurses caught providing COVID vaccination cards to persons without giving them a jab will be fired. He says this amounts to serious malpractice and the Nursing Council will be called in.
If anybody is guilty, they would have to deal with the penalties that is in our law. So that's the first thing. The second thing, however, because it's also a breach of professional conduct. And nurses are guided by our nursing laws. And again, we would be taking stringent actions by sending this information to the Nursing Council for them to act upon, because we cannot have nurses who are found in breach like this. It runs counter to the profession. So that's another avenue. And of course, if they're guilty, they would not be working with the ministry anymore.
2 nurses and a screening officer are on $150,000 bail each for providing forged vaccination cards to members of the public. Meanwhile, the Health Ministry says there are now 944 active cases. Of the 51 persons who are hospitalized, 18 are critically ill and are receiving intensive care. There have been 72 new cases within the past 24 hours. The death toll is now 1,009. The Guyana Power and Light GPL says it has sufficient generation capacity for the Christmas season, but there may be blackouts due to faults in the transmission system or downed utility poles. The divisional director of GPL's operations, Mr. Bharat Harjan, says the company will be able to generate 182.5 megawatts, and the projected electricity demand for the Christmas season is 136 megawatts. GPL's Chief Executive Officer Bart Dindial says no emergency generation sets will be acquired. While the company has 46.5 megawatts reserve capacity, road accidents can cause blackouts.
There won't be any use of emergency generation equipment this year. We have enough reserve capacity, and this is including base load capacity. But in terms of outages, we don't see an exposure on the generation side. Of course, on the network side, we always have an exposure, and that is, Mr. Harjan spoke to, essentially what we find happening around this time is, we got people out there driving and they seem to be targeting the poles. So we have a lot of those, and there's only so much we can do. We really have to ensure that we are ready to respond to those when they happen.
GPL's Chief Executive Officer Bart Dindial. Former Police Sergeant Colin Bailey, who was freed of a murder charge, is suing the state for more than $100 million. That's because a police witness told the court that he had no evidence on which to charge him. He had been charged with the murder of his common-law wife, businesswoman Sir Matthew Ramnares, in August 2013 and charged in February 2016. The High Court judge is dismissing the case in September 2021, had also criticized police for doing this quite often. In court papers seen by News Talk Radio Guyana, Mr. Bailey wants more than $100 million for wrongful arrest and subsequent detention for 5.5 years in contravention of his constitutional fundamental right not to be deprived of his personal liberty. Further, he wants the High Court to award more than $600,000 in damages for being wrongfully charged with murder without any basis, wrongfully detained, unlawfully detained in breach of his constitutionality, guaranteed fundamental right to liberty, and the branching of his constitutional right to protection from inhumane and degrading treatment. The $600,000 claim also includes damages for breaching court orders directing the Attorney General and the Director of Public Prosecutions to present the indictment against him without specified times set out in the orders. The claim also covers malicious prosecution by presenting an indictment and prosecuting him, although the prosecution admitted that there was no evidence to justify the charge against him. Further, he notes that he has lost more than $8 million in earnings for the 6 to 7 months that he had been incarcerated. And now in regional news. Operations of the Canawaima ferry service were affected yesterday after workers at South Drain, Suriname stopped working. They protested the fact that they have not yet been paid salaries for November because the company is broke. Eventually, the workers resumed duty at the ferry port, but it is not clear when they will stop working again. Star News reports that the Union Federation chairman, Dayanand Dwarka, says there is no clear idea when the workers will be paid. The company has said that due to COVID-19, it has not been earning revenue because the Guyana-Suriname border crossing had been closed for several months. The Canawaima ferry service says it has not been attracting a large number of cargo and passengers because many people are still using the Nakeri-Skeldon backtrack crossing. The Trinidad and Tobago government did not support the reappointment of the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles. The details are from TNT News Online.
Although the government was encouraged by the positive contribution of the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles, and his team, the government did not support his reappointment as they were concerned about the financial affairs of the university. This from Minister of Public Administration, Alison West. She was responding to a question on behalf of the Minister of Education in the Senate today. The minister was asked whether the government supported his renewal and to state the reasons if they didn't.
Based on the information presented in the reports provided to the Government of Trinidad and Tobago, and having regard to the need for the role of the Vice-Chancellor to have a transformative and new outlook in the approach to the business of education, the government did not support the reappointment of the Vice-Chancellor. Mr. Vice President, I wish to clearly state that the government did not delay the renewal of the appointment of the Vice-Chancellor. The term of the current Vice-Chancellor was due to expire on July 31st, 2021.
As it pertains to the affairs of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, she was also asked to indicate why the principal of the campus was given a one-year extension to his contract as opposed to a two-year extension as proposed by the government.
After significant deliberations at the meeting of the University Council on April 30th, 2021, the Council agreed that the current principal of the St. Augustine campus should be offered a one-year contract with the possibility of renewal for a further year. The deliberations of Council are generally confidential in nature.
Trinidad and Tobago's Minister of Public Administration, Alison West, in that TNT News Online report. Barbados is preparing to assemble a number of prefabricated houses from China. As we hear in this report from Barbados Today, the houses will be provided to persons who were earlier this year displaced by a violent storm.
Preparations are in full gear for local artisans to start assembling the Chinese-made prefabricated houses that will be the new residences of scores of people displaced by severe weather activity earlier this year. In an update on Tuesday at the site of government's new storage facility at the Six Rose Industrial Estate in St. Philip, where containers with the house parts from China were being offloaded, Minister of Housing, Lands and Maintenance Dr. William Duguid disclosed that a work plan is already in place.
So as soon as customs and health and so on do their due diligence, which is after we open the containers and check that they are what they're supposed to be and so on and so forth, as soon as we can get that done, we intend to start the erection of the houses as quickly as we can. We're going to have training going on for our local artisans over the next few days, and then once that training is complete and we get access to the materials, we will immediately start construction, and we'll be working night and day. We have lights available, and we'll be working night and day, 2 shifts of 8 hours each over a 16-hour day to be able to get as many of these installed as possible.
Okay, so definitely before the end of the year.
Well, I'm pushing for before the end of the year to get as many done as I can. And that is my goal, but you have to set a goal and then work towards it. And that's what we're doing.
Barbados's Minister of Housing, Dr. William Duguid. Antigua and Barbuda is proposing a resolution to the long-running gaming row with the United States. In 2005, the World Trade Organization ruled that Washington had violated international trade agreements by prohibiting operation of offshore internet gambling sites. Antigua claimed that it lost $3.4 billion a year due to the U.S. action, but the WTO awarded the island $21 billion. More from Antigua Broadcasting Service.
It's been 16 years since the World Trade Organization's award in favor of this country, and Washington has not budged an inch in paying. Now, Antigua and Barbuda is set to make a major move to secure a resolution. The government signaled its intention during the recent visit of the U.S. Ambassador Linda Tagliatella, as well as another official of the U.S. State Department.
We would have indicated to them that, we will extend a new offer in the new year, which will be significantly less than what we're pursuing. I think there's a difference in the interpretation in terms of liability. They have the view that the liability was capped at the $23 million US. We have the view that it was cumulative and that it continued to accrue each year.
Officials in St. John's are of the view Washington owes well over $200 million US based on the interest which has accrued. With no movement on this issue, Prime Minister Brown says his government will be moving decisively to engineer an amicable resolution.
We will look at the language again and get some legal advice and put forward a revised proposal early in the year, and I'm hoping we can bring this matter to a close as soon as possible.
He says his government does not want to have an antagonistic relationship with any country, large or small. The head of government is making it clear differences with the United States should not be construed as inherent animus.
That report from Garfield Beaufort of Antigua Broadcasting Service. The Chief Executive Officer of Republic Financial Holdings, which includes Republic Bank, says cybercrime is a major problem that requires larger investment. Mr. Nigel Baptiste made the comment at a Caribbean Development Bank conference on corruption, compliance and cybercrime ahead of International Anti-Corruption Day. He says more money has to be invested in countering cybercrime, more than what is needed to comply with anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism. And the Chief Executive Officer of Goddard Enterprises, another major Caribbean business, says cybercrime is the biggest threat facing businesses. Mr. Anthony Ali says work from home during COVID has increased the cybercrime threat. He says multiple logins from various locations is the major cause of cybercrime during the COVID-19 pandemic. And now for the international news, the latest coming from the BBC World Service.
Hello, I'm Moira Alderson with the BBC News. The United Nations World Food Programme has suspended distribution of food aid in 2 Ethiopian towns in the Amhara region. It comes after its warehouses were looted by rebel Tigrayan forces. Emmanuel Igunza reports.
The UN says that large quantities of food supplies, including nutritional items for malnourished children, were looted in the towns of Desi and Kombolcha in the Amhara region in recent days. It said staff were unable to prevent the stealing after facing extreme intimidation, including being held at gunpoint. A UN spokesman also accused government troops of commandeering 3 WFP humanitarian trucks and using them for their own purposes. He said the looting will worsen food insecurity and malnutrition in northern Ethiopia, where 9.4 million people now rely on food aid.
The Ethiopian government recently announced it had retaken Desi and Kombolcha, but Tigrayan rebels said the army had only recovered areas abandoned when they made a strategic withdrawal. Some MPs in Britain's governing Conservative Party have said they'll vote against the government's new coronavirus restrictions in England. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson is accused by some of introducing the restrictions to divert attention from a growing scandal over a Christmas party held by his staff during last year's lockdown. The government insists the new measures are needed to curb the spread of the Omicron variant. Here's Laura Koonsberg.
The mood in Boris Johnson's own party is becoming more sour by the day. And it matters, not just because of grisly or embarrassing details of what jokes were cracked or games were played, but it matters because to confront the pandemic, the government has always, as now, relied on 2 precious commodities. It needs public faith in the action it's taking and political support for those measures to be approved. That pair of factors defies scientific measures, but with the pandemic surging again, the concern must be that, in contrast, those factors are both in shrinking supply.
New Zealand plans to ban the sale of cigarettes to the next generation and beyond. Anyone aged 14 and under, when the legislation comes into effect in 2 years' time, will never be able to legally buy tobacco. Phil Mercer reports.
The government wants to stop young New Zealanders buying tobacco during their lifetime. New laws will gradually restrict the availability of cigarettes until the South Pacific nation is smoke-free. Smoking is the leading cause of preventable death in New Zealand and causes 1 in 4 cancers. Officials believe the laws will increase life expectancy among the indigenous Maori community. But some critics have said the nanny state measures would only create a black market for tobacco.
World News from the BBC. A military court in Uganda has convicted 2 soldiers for the killing of 3 people during protests last year. One received a life sentence, the other 35 years in prison. These are the first convictions related to killings by the security forces after demonstrations broke out following the arrest of the presidential candidate Bobi Wine at a campaign rally. The Deputy Prime Minister of Australia has tested positive for COVID-19 after arriving in the United States on an official trip. Shaima Khalil reports from Sydney.
Barnaby Joyce met UK cabinet ministers while in London before travelling to Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. It is unclear what transmission risk he posed. No other members of the Australian government delegation have tested positive for COVID-19 so far. Mr. Joyce said he'd returned negative tests before leaving the UK, but upon arrival in the United States, he felt some fatigue and pain in his legs. He told Australian media he'd been Christmas shopping in London, where people were lined up shoulder to shoulder. Mr. Joyce has cancelled meetings with US officials and said he would isolate for 10 days.
An Indian activist lawyer imprisoned without trial for more than 3 years has been released under strict conditions. Sudha Bharadwaj was one of 16 civil society campaigners arrested in 2018, accused of inciting violence and of having ties with Maoists. They deny the accusations. Mr. Bharadwaj, who is 60, has been ordered not to leave Mumbai, speak to the media or contact the other accused. Italy's competition watchdog has fined the US tech giant Amazon more than $1 billion for allegedly abusing its dominant position in selling online goods. The antitrust authority accused Amazon of favouring its own online logistics service to increase its dominance, which it said had harmed Italian sellers on its platform. That's the latest BBC News.
The news came to you with the compliments of Eureka Medical Laboratories.
Don't let the fear of contracting the coronavirus disease deter you from seeking the medical care you need. At Eureka Labs, we ensure the safety of our clients and staff with our rigid sanitization routine. This involves the use of ultraviolet lights to effectively rid the air and all surfaces of viruses and bacteria that may be present throughout the lab daily. The light works to rapidly inactivate microorganisms through a physical process that is invisible to human eye. So the next time you need a checkup, don't hesitate to give us a call on 225-7574 to schedule your appointment.
And now to end the news, a recap of the leads. The United States wants the Guyana government to make its position on fighting corruption clear. Guyana Power and Light says it cannot afford to pay workers an increase in salaries or a bonus. A former policeman who was freed on a murder charge 3 months ago is suing the state for almost $100 million. Regionally, the Trinidad and Tobago government did not back Sir Hilary Beckles for a second term as Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Antigua and Barbuda hopes to strike a deal that will see the United States paying millions of dollars in compensation in keeping with a ruling by the World Trade Organization. And internationally, New Zealand will ban the sale of tobacco to its next generation in a bid to eventually phase out smoking. And that's the end of the news.
This has been the news, compiled in the News Talk Radio Newsroom. For ongoing updates, visit demerarawaves.com, and you can check facebook.com/demwaves and twitter.com/demwaves.